They are still in the room, not in any mystical sense, in the most ordinary structural sense. The person who shaped you most, who died or left, or became someone you could no longer reach, or who was never quite what you needed them to be and now cannot be asked about it, is present in the room where you are sitting right now. They are present in the decision you made last Tuesday, in the way you received a compliment and immediately found it insufficient, in the argument that keeps recurring with someone who has never met them, in the particular shape of your ambition, your tenderness, your contempt for certain qualities in others that you cannot entirely explain. They are there in the deep grammar of how you move through the world, because the deep grammar was written in relationship with them. And relationship does not end when the person leaves. It ends, if it ends, when the relationship has been fully experienced, which is different from when it was last occupied. You have not moved on. You have organized your life in a way that does not require you to look directly at what that means. This is not a failure. The not looking has been, in many cases, adaptive, a way of continuing to function when the full weight of what was lost, or never had, or cannot now be retrieved, would have been too heavy to carry alongside everything else that required carrying. The compression was necessary. The question is not whether the compression was justified then. The question is what the compressed material is doing now, in the decisions you think you are making freely, in the reactions you think are about the present, in the pull toward or away from things that has a quality of certainty that exceeds anything your conscious reasoning has produced. The dead exert more force on your life in proportion to how completely you have decided they are finished with it. Jung spent considerable effort on a concept that tends to get reduced to the idea of unresolved grief, which misses the actual mechanism by enough distance to become misleading. What he was describing was not primarily an emotional phenomenon, not the feeling of loss, which is what most accounts of the unprocessed dead reduce it to. He was describing a structural phenomenon in the psyche, the way that a relationship or a significant figure or a version of oneself associated with that figure, when it cannot be fully experienced, does not simply diminish but gets stored in the unconscious as a complex. An autonomous cluster of psychic content organized around the unfinished relational material, carrying its own energy, exerting its own influence on behavior and perception from below the threshold of awareness. A complex, in Jung's technical usage, is not a problem to be solved. It is an organization of experience that the conscious personality has not been able to integrate, that is, too charged, too threatening, too contradictory, too demanding of something the conscious mind does not have available to give. The dead parent who was withholding, or unpredictable, or who died before the conversation that would have resolved the central question of the relationship, that material does not wait quietly. It organizes itself. It finds expression in the current life in the forms that are available to it, in the repetition of the relational dynamic with new people, in the internal voice that sounds like the dead person's judgment, in the specific quality of longing or rage or guilt that arrives without apparent cause in apparently unrelated situations. The complex is not the past intruding on the present. It is the past that never became the past, that is still present, still unfinished, still running its logic on the available material, which is your current life. Here is the specific texture of this that tends to go unexamined because it presents in forms that are easily attributed to other causes. You have standards for other people that have an unusual quality of finality. Not ordinary high standards, something more specific. A way of assessing certain behaviors or qualities in others that closes quickly, that does not revise easily in the face of contrary evidence, and that produces a response whose intensity is disproportionate to the actual significance of what triggered it. When someone is late in a way that does not actually cost you much, and the response is disproportionate. When someone fails to notice something you needed them to notice, and the response has the quality of confirmation rather than disappointment. As if you were waiting for exactly this evidence, as if the failure was expected, as if it fits into a pattern that preceded this specific person by a long time. That disproportionality is the complex making itself felt. The person in front of you is receiving the response that belongs to someone who is not in the room in the ordinary sense. They are triggering material whose origin is in a relationship that predates them and that has not been processed enough to be distinguishable from the current encounter. You are not simply reacting to what they did, you are reacting to what it means. And what it means is determined not by the current situation, but by the older one, which assigned that category of behavior a significance that became fixed before you were old enough to revise it. Jung called this projection, the transfer of unconscious content onto a present figure, who then becomes, in the experience of the person projecting, a carrier of qualities that belong to the complex rather than to themselves. The projected figure feels real, feels in fact more real than an ordinary perception, because the complex's charge amplifies the quality being projected. The person who triggers the father wound is not simply being perceived as imperfect. They are being experienced as a recapitulation of the central wound, with all the psychic energy that wound contains. The feeling is convincing precisely because it is old. It has the quality of certainty that belongs not to present perception, but to formative experience. What makes this hardest to address is not the emotional weight. It is that the complex is intelligent. By this, Jung meant something specific. The complex operates by logic, not the logic available to conscious reasoning, but its own internal logic, organized around the central experience that generated it. It selects from the present environment the evidence that confirms its schema. It interprets ambiguous situations in the direction of its established conclusions. It produces reactions that make sense from inside its logic, even when they make no sense from outside it. The person under its influence does not experience themselves as being run by an old wound. They experience themselves as accurately perceiving the present situation. This is the specific difficulty. The complex does not feel like the past. It feels like now. Viktor Frankl's observation about the space between stimulus and response has an application here that he did not develop, but that the argument implies. The space in which genuine choice is possible, in which the human capacity for self-determination can be exercised, is collapsed in the presence of an active complex to near zero. The stimulus arrives, the behavior that triggers the wound. The complex interprets it. This is what it means. The response follows, shaped not by present deliberation but by the established logic of the unprocessed material. The person experiences this sequence as choosing. What they are actually doing is being run. The recovery of the space requires something prior to the behavioral work that most accounts of this recommend. It requires the recognition that the response has two components, the present perception and the historical charge. Distinguishing between them is not accomplished by deciding to distinguish between them. It requires sufficient familiarity with the historical material that its arrival can be recognized as such, rather than experienced as simply the truth of the present situation. That familiarity requires looking at the historical material directly, which is precisely what the compression was organized to prevent. There is a specific form this takes in relation to dead parents. And by dead I mean not only the literally deceased, but the parent who has become unreachable through distance or dementia, or the simple fact of a relationship that has sealed itself into a form that can no longer be revised, that is worth naming because it is otherwise very difficult to see. The dead parent continues to speak, not metaphorically, functionally. There is an internal voice organized around their characteristic judgment or expectation or disappointment that participates in your decisions in ways that have nothing to do with what they would actually think, because they are no longer thinking anything. The voice is the complex, the residue of a relationship that was internalized before it could be adequately metabolized, that now operates as an internal presence with the authority it was given in the original relationship, which was the authority of the person on whom your survival and recognition depended. This voice is not wisdom. It is not their actual values, retrieved in some meaningful way. It is the version of them that was frozen at the moment of internalization, which was, in most cases, not the moment of their death, but a much earlier moment when the relational pattern became fixed in the child's psychic structure. The parent who died at 80 is frequently present not as the 80-year-old, but as the person they were when you were 8. That is the voice in the room. That is the judge whose standards you are still, in significant ways, organizing your life around. The tragedy of this is not simply that the voice is demanding, it is that the voice cannot be satisfied. Not because you are failing to meet the standard, but because the standard is generated by a complex, not by a person, and complexes are not satisfied by achievement. They are satisfied, if they are satisfied at all, by being fully experienced, by the material being brought into consciousness and held there long enough to be actually processed rather than managed. Here is the application that most people in this situation have not considered, and that tends to arrive with the quality of something that has been obvious all along but was never looked at directly. Your relationship to your own failure, not the public account of how you handle failure, the narrative about learning and resilience that has been assembled from available materials and is coherent enough to be offered when asked. The private account, the interior experience of having gotten something wrong. Not catastrophically, but in the ordinary ways that accumulate. How long it stays. What the voice says while it stays. Whose voice it is. For most people carrying unprocessed relational material from a significant figure, the response to their own failure has a quality of condemnation that exceeds what the situation warrants by a specific margin, the margin that belongs to the original relationship. The failure is not simply a mistake to be understood and corrected. It is evidence. Evidence of something that the complex has already decided and that the failure confirms, and that would have been confirmed by the success too, because the complex is not evaluating the performance. It is running the verdict that was established before any performance was available to be evaluated. This is why the self-criticism in this particular configuration is so difficult to address through ordinary means. The instruction to be kinder to yourself, to apply the same compassion to your own failures that you would apply to a friend's, this instruction is correct and largely ineffective because it is addressed to the conscious, reasoning while the problem is located elsewhere. The harshness is not a failure of self-compassion. It is the complex speaking in the voice of the person whose judgment organized the original wound. And the complex cannot be reasoned with by the part of the self that has decided to be more reasonable. Dostoevsky understood something about the relationship to the dead that his most psychological novel makes visible, but that his interpreters tend to locate in a different argument. The underground man's essential condition is not alienation, as it is usually described, but the impossibility of conclusion. He cannot finish anything, not a relationship, not a line of thought, not a self-assessment, because finishing would require the arrival of a verdict, and the verdict, when it arrives, will be the one he already knows is coming and cannot bear to receive. He prolongs everything. The suffering extends not because he enjoys it, but because the suffering, however terrible, is preferable to the conclusion. The conclusion is known. The suffering keeps it at bay. This is the structure of most people's relationship to the unprocessed dead. The grief that is not grief, that is something more complex than grief, that has resentment and guilt and love, and the specific anger of someone who has been deprived of a conversation they needed, cannot be concluded because conclusion requires the full experience of the loss. And the full experience of the loss includes the experience of what was lost that was never had, the recognition that wasn't given, the conversation that wasn't possible, the version of the relationship that the living person's limitations prevented from existing. What you are mourning is not only the person who died. You are mourning the relationship that the person's presence made it possible to hope for, and that their absence now makes permanently unavailable. You are mourning a future that was foreclosed, and that mourning is harder than ordinary grief because it has no clean object. It is not the loss of what was, but the loss of what could have been, which means it is the loss of something that, in a sense, never existed and is now impossible. That is an unusually difficult thing to grieve, It requires the capacity to hold contradictory truths simultaneously, that the person was real and limited, and that you loved them, and that the love did not prevent the wound, and that you cannot now go back to them and ask for what was missing, and that the missing thing is still missing and always will be. Most people cannot do this all at once. They grieve one part and compress the rest. The compressed material enters the complex. The complex keeps working. The complication that most accounts of this leave out is the one that makes the work actually difficult, rather than simply painful. The unprocessed dead are not only loss, they are also identity. The wound, the relationship, the unresolved material. It is not simply a burden being carried. It is, for many people, a significant part of the foundation on which the self was built. The child who organized themselves around the absent or unpredictable or withholding parent did not simply suffer the relationship. They became someone in response to it, developed capacities, commitments, orientations, and self-understandings that would not exist in the same form without the specific wound the relationship produced. The sensitivity that came from having to read a room carefully because the adult in it was unpredictable. The discipline that came from having learned early that approval was conditional and performance was the access point. The capacity for empathy that came from having had to understand another person's inner state with considerable precision in order to navigate it safely. These are real. They are among the most genuine things about you, and they were produced by the wound. This means that processing the wound, really processing it, not managing it from a new angle, threatens something beyond the comfort of the familiar. It threatens the self that was built in response to the wound. The self that knows how to be hurt, how to survive difficulty, how to find the reading of a room. The self that, in some respects, was only possible because things went the way they went. This is not an argument for leaving the wound alone. It is an argument for understanding why the leaving it alone is so persistent despite genuine intention to do otherwise. You are not simply protecting yourself from pain. You are protecting the self that pain produced. And that self, however costly in terms of what the wound continues to exert, is the self that has gotten you here, that you recognize in the mirror, that other people recognize as you, that you have evidence of as capable of navigating the world. The invitation to process the wound is, at some level, an invitation to become someone you do not yet know. That is a different kind of loss, and it tends not to be named as a loss, which is part of why the processing stalls. Marcus Aurelius, writing at the end of a life that had included loss on a scale that most people are not required to absorb, the death of children, the failure of friendships, the slow-motion dissolution of the world he was trying to hold together, returned in his notebooks to a formulation that is usually read as stoic detachment and is actually something considerably more precise. He wrote, in various forms, that the task is not to determine how to feel less about what has been lost. The task is to see it clearly, to submit the actual experience, including the parts that are contradictory and uncomfortable and resistant to resolution, to the kind of attention that does not require it to become something else. He was not counseling suppression. He was counseling something much harder, the willingness to look at the actual thing without immediately converting it into a lesson or a reminder or a story about growth, and to let the looking produce whatever it produces. This is what the compression prevents. The compression converts the unprocessed material into a manageable form before the full experience of it can occur. The grief becomes the lesson. The resentment becomes the insight about the relationship. The love for the flawed, limited, genuinely beloved person who left before the conversation was finished, gets converted into the narrative of the relationship, which is safer than the love itself because narratives can be organized and the love cannot. What the dead are owed is the actual experience of them, not the managed version, not the lesson they became, not the wound they left as evidence of what they could not give. The actual experience of who they were, in the full complexity of that, including the ways in which their limitations were not malicious, and the ways in which the love was real even when the love was insufficient, and the ways in which the relationship, however painful, produced in you things that would not exist without it. That experience requires more than you have been able to give it, not because you are incapable, because the giving requires something the compression has been protecting against, the willingness to be genuinely and unreservedly sad about what actually happened, which is different from the managed sadness that can be described to a therapist and filed as evidence of emotional intelligence. Epictetus drew a line between what is in our control and what is not, that is usually applied to external circumstances, but applies with particular force to the past. The past is not in your control. What happened with the person who is now gone, what was said and not said, what was given and withheld, what the relationship was and what it could never be, is fixed. It cannot be revised. It cannot be visited and corrected. It is the one domain in which the dichotomy of control is most absolute and most consistently violated by the ongoing attempt to process the fixed events in ways that produce different meanings, that reframe what happened into something that can be incorporated into the self-narrative with less damage, that convert the irreversible into something that can be worked with. The working with is not wrong. The meaning-making is not wrong. What Epictetus was pointing at, and what applies here, is the cost of confusing the meaning-making with the actual encounter with what is there. The past cannot be changed. The encounter with it, the full, unmanaged experience of what happened and who was lost and what it means that they are gone, is the only thing that is actually available to be done. And that encounter is postponed endlessly by the more comfortable activity of deciding what the past means. Meaning comes after the experience. Most people are doing the meaning while declining the experience. The meaning, arrived at without the experience, is a kind of intellectual structure built over a hole. It holds in the sense that it does not collapse in ordinary circumstances, and it fails to address what is underneath it, which continues to exert force in proportion to how thoroughly the structure above it prevents the encounter. What you owe the dead is not loyalty to their version of you. It is not the continuation of their project, or the completion of what they could not finish, or the preservation of a self that was shaped by them, and that changing would somehow betray. These are the forms that the unprocessed obligation most commonly takes, and they share a structure. They convert the genuine obligation into a form that the complex can manage, that feels like honoring the lost person while actually serving the function of keeping the full encounter with the loss at a distance. What you owe the dead is the experience of them, the full contradictory grief and love and anger and gratitude experience of who they actually were, and what the relationship actually was, and what it cost you, and what it gave you, and what it means that they are gone before the conversation was complete. That experience is not available on demand. It is not produced by deciding to have it, or by finding the right framework, or by the right amount of therapeutic work. It arrives, when it arrives, in the way that genuine grief always arrives, unbidden at moments of apparent safety, with a force that the managed version could not have prepared you for. What you can do, what is actually in your control, is stop blocking the arrival. Stop converting the material into something workable before it has had the chance to be what it is. Stop deciding what the dead mean before you have finished experiencing what they were. The person you are carrying in the deep structure of your decisions, in the voice that speaks in registers of judgment and longing and guilt that you have never fully traced to their source. That person deserves more than the managed version of themselves that you have been keeping. Not because they earned it, necessarily. Not because the relationship was good enough to warrant the full weight of the grief. But because you are the one who is still alive, and what you do with what they left in you is the only version of the relationship that is still available to be completed. The completion is not resolution. It is not the achievement of peace or understanding or the feeling that the debt has been paid. It is the willingness to let the full experience of the loss be as large as it actually is, without immediately making it smaller so that you can continue to function. That willingness is what you owe them, and more importantly, it is what you owe yourself.